can't mean it more than I mean it right now when I say thank you to all of you. And I just feel inspired to just start in Fuji Ziji Amen. Another thing I want to say, my PhD is actually in classical Chinese, and I studied Bangu, and I wrote my first book about the Hanshu, and now I write about the Catholic Church. But when I remember reading this really boring dictionary called the Shuo and Jiezi, there was an etymology of the character Ren, Ren Ai de Ren. This one? It's actually a person in profile. Sort of standing like this, right? Right? So what does that really mean? Whenever people come together. The etymology, we don't have a good translation. But I think the best translation is when we are together, we are done. And thank you to the board for bringing us together. This is... So I have more to say than I can say in 30 minutes, but I will try to stop at 25 if I can. Also, the first thing that came to mind is an old Chengyu I studied in Chinese, Hua She Tianzu. I don't really think I can add much to what's already been said, but I'll try to say something. I care very deeply about this project of teaching the church in China. But let me just begin with what I call a kind of interesting way of thinking about the history of the church in China. And I remember I was doing research. I was reading Xin et Silon, a Jesuit publication that was published sort of, about the missions in China. It became Xin et Madagascar. And there is this interesting layout in the middle. It published in the 1950s, and I call it the two Carls layout. You open it up, and there's a crying baby on one side, and there's a smiling baby on one side. And the smiling baby has in his hands a copy of the Theological Insights of Karl Rahner. And the baby is smiling and happy. But you look at the other page, and it's a baby that's very bitter looking and crying, and tears are actually, I don't know how they staged this photograph, but the other baby is holding a copy of the writings of Karl Marx. And that was a very, I think, telling advertisement or promotion of the time. And when I teach the history of the church in China, I try to penetrate below the glossy promotionalism, below the glossy propaganda, and think about the church kind of on its own terms, from both points of view. And I really appreciate Father Standard and Father Jeremy's sort of call or summons to look at things from the Chinese point of view. There are two passages from the Analects I have to quote. I love these because when I walk into the classroom to teach the history of the Catholic Church in China, I say these two things to myself. 知之者不如好之者，好之者不如乐之者. To basically, knowing something is not as good as being fond of it. And being delighted in it is not as good as being fond of it. And I think we have to just begin with inspiring our students to delight in what we are teaching them. And second, this one I really like, 不欢之 不患人之不及之，患不知人也. That is, we should worry less about what others understand about us than we worry about how much we understand about others. Well, this really is, from my point of view, the essence of teaching the history of the church in China. And let me just sort of, I've taken 5 minutes? Okay. Let me say a few things. First, my first comment about the teaching of Christian history in China is that Christians were the first to teach the history of China in general. You have this Franciscan and Jesuit enterprise of collecting Chinese texts. There were scholars in Rome who, when they first visited the Vatican archive collection, really texts that were exported to the Vatican by the Jesuits, these early scholars in Europe don't know what to do. In fact, they're trying to figure out which side is up when they're looking at these Chinese texts, and they're befuddled by the characters and by the paper. But that really marks the beginning of, I think, what I would call a kind of a 中西文化交流, a East-West cultural exchange. Begins with the transmission of texts back and forth. The translation and interpretation of these texts was done by Jesuits. And the first histories of China were produced by Jesuits. What this means is that Spence was right, Jonathan Spence was right, when he put Ricci and the figurist Jesuits, really at the front of his research of the history of China. While Duan Yucai was spearheading, this is a bit technical, scholar talk, but just bear with me. While Duan Yucai in the late Qing dynasty was spearheading a type of scholarship called Kaozheng, he's looking at classical texts, and he's reading through the Shiji, the Mengzi, the Hanfeizi, the Xunzi. He's reading through Banhu's Hanshu. He's reading through these classical texts. And Duan Yucai is trying to strip away commentaries of what later Chinese scholars were saying about those texts. What later Chinese scholars, how they were interpreting those texts. At the very same time, the Jesuits were adding layers onto the same text with their own hermeneutical ways of reading them. They were adding a kind of biblical layer upon these classical Chinese texts. So the Chinese are stripping away, and then the Jesuits are adding layers on. And so you see a kind of attempt to, from the Chinese point of view, understand their own past, a Jesuit attempt to tell China's scholars how to interpret their past, which created some tension, obviously. So what I think we need to do really is to look at texts. I'm a very strong believer in this idea that we need to go below the surface of the promotion of the glossy history and read the text on their own level. Let me begin with something else, or let me continue with another point. And this is my own idea of why I think we should study China's ecclesial past. One reason, right? I think there is a terrible misunderstanding of the history of Christianity in China in general by people who just get their knowledge from some of the very sources that I write on, some sort of online blogs. Sometimes I read what others are saying about the church in China, and I have to shake. Well, I don't have any hair left to pull out, but I'm quite frustrated. One thing I read a lot is that China needs to be introduced to Christianity. When Americans say China needs to be introduced to Christianity, I have to sort of pause and think China's church is vastly older than the United States of America. And we can trace the history of Christianity in China to the Tang Dynasty. So I think people need to be better educated. It's one reason I teach classes on the history of Christianity in China. And second, I often hear this. This is one of the most difficult things I hear, and that is, only underground Catholics are real Catholics. I was so happy, I don't know if Professor Madsen is still here.
No, he had to leave.
Okay. When he said that let me not whitewash the very real divisions between the underground and the above ground communities, not churches, communities. There are very serious divisions. Let me not whitewash that. I don't think it's fair and honest. But let me also say it's not fair and honest to say they're two different churches or that they don't have anything to do with each other. I can't tell you how often I'm at meetings with clergy, and they'll show me these wonderful photographs of clergy retreats in China. And there's the sort of state-sanctioned bishop in the middle. And then the bishop will say to me, well, this guy over here, this other priest, he's actually the ordinary of the diocese. The underground bishop, who's the ordinary, and I'm under him. Or they'll say, this priest over here is another underground priest. So there's a kind of, in fact, in one province, the underground, in two provinces actually, as I just recall, the underground and so-called above ground bishops live in the same apartment. And they collaborate together. So I think it's time to retract some of our kind of general opinions or some of our ideas. And I think by teaching the history of the church in China, we can begin to do that. Here's what I also view as some pressing needs today, just in terms of teaching the history of Christianity in China. I've received, just in the last couple of years, maybe a dozen or more phone calls or emails from people asking me where they can, and by the way, mostly priests from China who are Chinese have contacted me. Where can I go to get to write a dissertation and study the history of the church in China? Most of us are either out researching or we're at small liberal arts colleges that don't offer doctoral programs who do this research. I think that major institutions, Notre Dame, other secular institutions, I think it would be wonderful if people like me, and this is not a job plea, this is me just saying we need to have a venue wherein people, Chinese priests actually, or sisters, can go to study the history of the church in China and conduct research under the guidance of a mentor. And so that's one aspect that I would like to sort of emphasize. I scribbled my notes at Starbucks this morning, so I had to try and figure out where I am. Also, what are the principal issues that my students are asking? What are the principal questions my students ask? What are they most interested in when they study the church in China? Well, here's what, I take these surveys, here's what they say. We're interested in the, quote, Nestorians, the Church of the East, and their mission to China. We're interested in figurists, because the more they learn about figurists, the more they kind of shake their head. How did they interpret it this way? They're interested in the French protectorate in China of Catholic missions. They're interested more and more in what's called the mission civilisatrice, the, quote, civilizing mission of the missionaries in China. This sort of idea that by going to China they can civilize China. They're very interested in that concept. And they're also very interested in this idea of an ecclesia militans. Well, what does it mean when, before a missionary would go to China, they would sing these hymns of departure, and the hymns of departure were couched in rhetoric of battle and warfare with this other culture? What does that mean for in first encounter, before that first encounter has? So in short, my students are very interested in their words, how do we rethink the whole idea of Christianity in these various cultures as a form of bridge building, not a form of imagining the, quote, other as an enemy. So I've very much been influenced by these questions. Now, also, when we teach the history of Christianity in China, we often talk about Ricci. I like Shusaku Endo's book, Silence. I think Tricia read that. This is the first thing we read, is that text, and it rattles my students. I teach at a Presbyterian university, and they're rattled by it, because the priest apostatizes, and all along they're rooting for him not to apostatize, and he apostatizes, and they come, seriously, I've had students come to class afterward crying, he apostatized, and so they have a million questions about how to interpret that, how do we rethink that, or how do we process that. So there are two ways of reading these texts, and I think one question that I think we need to confront is, what text do I assign when I teach a course on the history of Christianity in China? There are no readers of primary sources. They don't exist. So there are a lot of texts. Many texts are from the 1950s talking about communism, and most texts are about Ricci, by the way. So how am I doing for time? Okay, good. All right. So what do I assign? And I'm trying desperately to translate texts into English so that my students have access to primary works. Let me give you an example of how I approach teaching Christianity in China. I like to give examples of two views. One is what I think has been favored, that is, look at how bad the missionaries have behaved. So let me give you an example. I'm revising my book. It just got accepted at University of Washington. And I wrote the entire book at TBC, at the Beijing Center in Beijing. So I very much recommend that place as a fantastic venue for research. Alphonse Favier was the bishop in Beijing at Beitang during the Boxer Uprising at the end of the 19th century into the early 20th century. And after the Boxer Uprising, attacks on the cathedral, and he had survived, he wrote this back home, quote, "Once more, this incident has proved the necessity of the French protectorate of the Catholic missions, a protectorate which France has never abandoned and which the Church was never willing to take away from her. You will always see a consulate next to a church, with the tricolor French flag sheltering the Catholic cross. The admirals and officers compete with each other for the glory of the religion and the fatherland." That's a quote from Alphonse Favier. So this conjures a very interesting sort of question of this admixture of the church militant and the state militant, sort of collaborating together. There's no wonder that so many of my friends in China say Buddhism came to China on the back of an elephant, but Christianity came to China on the barrel of a gun. So I think as Christians or as Catholics or as people who study this topic, I think that's an important issue to consider in the classroom. Meanwhile, at the exact same moment that Alphonse Favier is having these experiences and promoting this mission civilisatrice, you have a Franciscan missionary of Mary's sister in Shanxi province living in Taiyuan. And it's during the terrible drought, and she writes home in a letter. How much longer do I have? 5?
No, 15.
15? Oh, I'm so great. Okay. She writes home in a letter this, quote, "With a heavy heart and with tears streaming out of my eyes, I just gave away all we had left to help these starving children. Our mission resources are so few and mouths are so many," unquote. I think we need to sort of remember that the mission wasn't all about the Ecclesia Militans. It was also about service, and it always was. And so I try to represent the history of the church in China in a way that my students are able to see both sides. All right. I actually wrote on the last page, "If time, say this," so I think I have time. That's wonderful. So a few final comments. I said something about service. I said something about looking at these ideals of the church militant, these ideals of, quote, civilizing China. And I've heard a lot over the course of this meeting about service. And I think service is crucial. I think human rights is crucial. But I also think as a Catholic that the issue of sacramentality in China and the history of sacramentality in China is also crucial.
Yes.
So often I'm in villages, a village called Qingyan, not too far away from Guiyang. The woman I met there next to the church who was the caretaker was weeping as she said, "I see a priest every 3 to 5 years. And so many people here are desperate for the sacraments." I think we need to think about the history of the sacraments in China, the importance of the sacraments. Service is great, but so are the sacraments. So that's another dimension. And in thinking about the history of the sacraments in China, there have been many issues historically that we Westerners find puzzling. We find puzzling. One, let me give you an example. I think the Tianjin Jiaoan, the Tianjin incident, was it 1870, 1871? Anyone know? Something like that. Priests, sisters, Chinese Catholics died in this terrible incident. And some of the rumors were that the Catholic missionaries were carving out, they were carving out the eyes of converts. And this rumor really helped to create a stir of animosity against the missionaries. That was one of several rumors. But where does that rumor come from? If you look at a text, for example, and this is why I think studying history is important. If you look at texts from the even the late 18th century into the early 19th century, you see that a text called the Bishe Shi was published in a sort of a record to ward off unorthodox ideas. And in a certain illustrated edition, it shows these Jesuits, they're identified in a textual part, with the Chinese convert, and they're actually carving out eyes. And it describes how they take the eyes and they alchemically turn the eyeballs into silver, and that's why they can build these enormous Gothic-style churches. Well, where does that rumor come from? I think if we study the sacraments and how they were administered, it's very clear that in last rites, because the person is lying down in the image, that in last rites there's this part of anointing of the eyes, and the face is covered. And I think too that it's that kind of thing that helps us to better understand the origin of these rumors. I also have heard many Westerners who were with me in China who have been with me in China, say something like, why is it that in China the confessionals are open? That's unorthodox. It's incorrect. But there are actually incredibly good historical reasons why confessionals are open in China, and that's another a sort of sacramental historical thing that's important. And I also think it's interesting, we can reveal things like in text during the Qing dynasty, during the elevation of the host during Mass, it was common. It was common, more common than it's extremely common, that a string of firecrackers was ignited during the elevation of the host in China. That's kind of, I think, I tell that to priests today, and they think, they do it inside the church? There's a lot of sort of technical questions. When did they do that? How did they do that? But that was a form of celebrating the doctrine the church teaches about the Eucharist. Men wore hats to Mass. Women did not, for the most part, wear a veil at a time when canon in the West designated no hats for men and veils, coverings for women. China is not the West. And Amyo died from angst over misinterpretation and miscommunication over a dialogue between East and West. So I think we need to understand our past. I think that's very important. And I think venues like this will help. And now I get to the if times. I would like to see us who care about the history of the church in China collaborate more. I would like to see us spend more time in China and collaborating with people there who are interested in the same questions. I'm always surprised how other professors in China ask very different questions than I ask about the history of the church in China. I think that we need to be better in this country at studying other languages. I often feel so inferior as I'm doing research in France or Germany or Italy, and the researchers around me are cycling through languages like it's a Rolodex, the old Rolodex. I think we need to work on our language skills here. And just in part of this too, I think that we need to preserve things like historical photographs of the mission. One of the most common questions I hear in China is, where can I get images of my hometown and the church here from way back, and from the beginning of the mission, when photographs were first taken. Well, I think this is crucial. I just received a grant, and I have an intern now, and we have something like 3,000 to 4,000 images that we're starting with. And there'll be a digital archive of both Catholic and Protestant mission history in China. basically we have mostly Jesuit at this point, but a great deal of Presbyterian, some Baptist, actually a lot of Franciscan as well. So we have 3,000 to 4,000 images that will begin to appear on this a web page probably within the next 6 months to a year. And also, I think it's important that we understand what it means by local church. That there is a different way of approaching Christianity, and it doesn't mean it's a different Christianity. I teach at a Presbyterian university, and all of my students know what it is to go to a service and have preaching and Bible reading and hymns. But what I like to do is I start my class with an image of the Divine Liturgy of John Chrysostom. And the minute they see that, my students often say, but that's not Christian. Yes, that's older than what you do, friend. That's normally how I approach that. Then we look at the Syriac liturgy, and then we look at a Maronite liturgy, and they say that it sounds Middle Eastern, it sounds Islamic, and then I tell them that that's actually Aramaic. That's the language of Christ. And then I show them a Mass in China, several. And then I played them the tones of the before Mass and after Mass chanting. And they listen to that for a while. And then I turn off the video and I play another recording. And they think, oh, that's after Mass chanting. And then I tell them, that's the chanting of sutras in a Buddhist monastery. And it's stunning to them that the Catholic liturgical singing has been taken from or borrowed from Buddhist sutra chanting. Well, in any case, let me just end with how important, just reiterating how important our collaboration is, how important this history is, how important it is that we develop more venues within which people can study the history of the church in China. And if I have 3 minutes left, I'll end with an anecdote. Not a personal anecdote, a letter. There's a Ming Dynasty philosopher named Li Zhi, and he had met Matteo Ricci at several banquets. And Li Zhi wrote to a friend of his about a meeting with Matteo Ricci. And I'll paraphrase the letter. He writes to his friend, I just met a Western religious man, Matteo Ricci. And I have to say, his Chinese was impressive. He was indistinguishable from the other Chinese in the room. And I also have to say that his knowledge of the classics was better than ours. He really knew the classics and had memorized them. And let me also say that Ricci was polite. He understood how to interact. It was as if he were a Chinese person. What an impressive man. And the last thing Li Zhi asked is, why is he here? Surely he doesn't want to replace the teachings of Kongzi, of Mengzi, with the teachings of this foreign religious figure. And I think the bottom line of any academic enterprise is the why question. So I will end with Li Zhi's question. I believe in it, but I think we all need to ask the same question. What is it that brings us together, and what is it that motivates us to make this research important? So thank you.